So after I got out of college, I had my second long-term girlfriend. And about 6 months into dating, she looked at me one night when we were sitting on the couch and said, "Hey, you're good with money. Can you teach me how to be good with money?" And I was taken aback by the question at first. And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And she said, "Well, no one ever taught me to be good with money, and I'm pretty heavily in debt, and I need help." I said, "Well, sure, I can help you out with that." And it was really the first time, as I shared in our last episode's intro, I was doing fake tax returns at 8 years old, so it just never occurred to me that people weren't interested in financial matters the way that I was, and that if they weren't interested in it and someone didn't teach them, they could get to being adults without having those skills. And so we sat down and I showed her how to do a budget, and we worked on getting her out of debt. And to this day, it's probably one of my largest kind of feel-good things that I ever accomplished, even though it wasn't professional, to help somebody establish their financial life. She now owns a house and has gone on to get out of debt, obviously, and purchase a home. So with that, we will start episode 14 of the Valuability Podcast. Obviously, dealing with debt will be our topic this week. The Valuability Podcast is for financial advisors, business owners, and anyone interested in financial planning, business, leadership, and personal development. We believe that financial success comes from building a plan on the foundation of your values, and building your ability will help you get there. My name is Danforth Fleek. I was a financial advisor and product wholesaler for a number of insurance companies for over 20 years. Each week, I am joined by my good friend, mentor, Philip Simonson. Philip, gone directly into brutally hot down here in Minneapolis after summer starts, and immediately it's 90 degrees and 80% humidity. So after suffering through our that was one of the things when I moved to Minnesota as a teenager, I thought, man, well, at least the summers are going to be nice.
Our weather is our name. It's probably one of our, and probably like most people, number one thing we talk about when you first meet someone. Well, how's the weather? Your way. Or what do you think about the weather? It's always... It's one thing that's, it changes. It's not San Diego, that's for sure.
The other thing that I never thought about Minnesota before I moved here was bugs. There's already about 1 billion mosquitoes here.
Our Minnesota state bird.
Right. The humming mosquito. So you can find the Valuability Podcast wherever you find your podcasts: Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn. We also have a YouTube channel. Search Value-Ability on YouTube to find us there. Or you can find us on our website, value-ability.com. Click on the Episodes tab. Wherever you find us, please like, review, subscribe, and share. And as I've mentioned in the last couple of episodes, sharing is really the biggest thing you can do for us at this point. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram at value_ability on both of those platforms. Twitter is the best way to get in touch with us, and Instagram is where we put visuals. If you can't get to our website, you can check out all of our documents on Instagram. And then lastly, you can also reach out to us via Facebook. Search at Valuability, all one word, on Facebook to find our Facebook page. So, dealing with debt. Now, the first thing that I always talk about when starting the topic of debt is the idea of good debt versus bad debt, because there definitely is good debt and there's bad debt, right? And this ties back into a topic that we have talked about a number of times, both specifically and then also just in passing, the rule of 72, right?
Mm-hmm.
The rule of 72, we've talked about it in terms of compounding interest on your investments, right? It's the amount of time that it takes for something to double, right? So if you have a 7.2% rate of return, you divide that into 72, that's 10. That's 10 years that it would take your investment to double. Now, likewise, if you go the opposite direction, and this isn't a realistic inflation rate, but just to keep the numbers the same, let's say inflation was at 7.2%. Now, that would be the opposite, right? So 7.2 into 72, that's 10. It would mean that if inflation was at 7.2%, your money would be worth half as much in 10 years, right? Because inflation is eroding your purchasing power. I use this same concept when talking to people about debt and the idea of good debt versus bad debt, right? Whatever your inflation number is kind of your bellwether number for, hey, is this debt an okay debt or good debt or a bad debt, right? Now, the number one bad debt of all bad debts, of course, is credit cards, right? So when I would teach my clients the rule of 72, that I would put that number out, 20%. I'd show them different numbers and then 20%, and usually I would kind of walk them into it by saying, hey, now 20%, that's probably not a great or a realistic target for our portfolios, but do you want to know where the 20% rate of return or 20% compounding interest number does play into your life? Credit cards. All of your credit cards are going to be in that. I think I have one that I've had for a super long time that I have a 13.5% rate on, and that's a really good rate. Most of the other ones I have are 18 to 20 something percent. So rate of inflation is always kind of that bellwether number. So we look at 3%. So some of the good debts, obviously a mortgage is an okay debt for a number of reasons. Right now, Philip, what was the rate that you got on your the first house you bought?
Oh, Dan, yeah, that was back in 84. It was 9%. And when I was selling in 82, they were as high as 15%.
Yeah, so 9% even today people would be shocked at, right?
Right.
Like a 9% rate on a mortgage. I mean, I think we have a whole generation of people that have had single-digit mortgages. I have the same experience. We came home from England in 1981, and my dad actually had to buy a house contract for deed because he couldn't get the mortgage. Like he just couldn't, literally could not get a mortgage that was a rate that could make the payment affordable. So we actually had to take a different route for financing. So today mortgages are very good rates for the most part, but also look, going into debt to buy a home, having a home is positive for a bunch of different reasons. You're building equity. You are having a place to build your life, and something that is yours. So there's a whole host of other reasons besides the fact that it is also a good debt. Now, am I correct that the mortgage interest deduction has gone away?
Yes, for the majority of the people, absolutely, because you increase the standard deductions. So
Right.
that's gone away. And you raise another good couple points here, Dan, that I just want to build on. 20%, as you said, that credit card debt. Well, it's just taking your rule of 72. If you just don't pay off the principal, you're just standing still. You're treading water. At 20% into 72 in 3.2 years, it's doubling.
Absolutely.
You're just you're constantly playing catch up. So the first tip I always look, credit cards are okay. A lot of people, that's all they take now. Unfortunately, if you can pay for cash, studies show that if you pay in cash, you spend less. But if you do use the credit card, make sure you pay it off. And in the home too, and Dan, correct me if I'm wrong, the rule of thumb I always use for a home, because you don't want to work for your mortgage, is 30 to 35% of whatever your monthly take home is. Your mortgage should not exceed that percentage. That's your principal, interest,
Right.
taxes, and insurance. So that way you're not working just to pay a mortgage, because you got to live as well.
Yeah, that 30 to 40% is the number that I've seen, depending on where I have seen that. I've kind of flip-flopped back and forth during my adult life. You can successfully rent and save money.
Mm-hmm.
Many people have socially, built into their mind, our society has this idea that homeownership is one of the, must-do ways of building wealth. It's not necessarily true. It's basically a forced form of savings, right? You're being forced to invest in something that has value on a consistent basis, and if you don't make that investment, they kick you out of your home. So it's basically a forced form of savings. If you rent, you can, now I've run the numbers, you can successfully do that and build wealth. It requires that you be very disciplined, right? It's not forced. You can stop saving if you're a renter. And so that's one of the reasons why societally we feel like, hey, homeownership is a prerequisite for building wealth. It's really not, but it is a way of enforcing discipline on yourself. So
Yes.
I've had clients that have asked, hey, do I have to buy a house? Well, no, you just need to be disciplined.
Correct. Putting yourself first in that payroll line. And the other thing I think people do not look at from a homeowner perspective is it is really, truly still a liability. It's not an asset. I define an asset as where that's my money is earning money. And this home, a lot of people consider it an asset. The bankers do. But it's not earning you any money until hopefully you sell it. It's appreciation, and it turns to a gain down the road. In the meantime, though, if you're not handy, or if you don't like putzing on the weekends, because it's constantly going to nickel and dime you. You've got your taxes you're going to have to pay on it, real estate taxes. There's going to be upkeep that you're going to have to versus renting. That you're going to have to spend. Furnace goes out, you've got, a leak happens. You got to replace the roof. You're doing your landscaping. It seems to always be something. So you got to be really, really careful. And that's why I also like to lean more to, if I'm going to do it, to the 30 to 35%. And what I like about homes long term is I get to pay it back with cheaper dollars with the inflation.
No, I agree. Look, I bought a multi-unit property back in 2002 when my mom came to live with me, and let me tell you about getting nickel and dimed. Like, just the major things that I've had to do to the house, I can add up, and it pretty much equals the appreciation of my home over the last 20 years. That's not even to mention just the, a faucet here, a light bulb here. It's probably even more in the negative column. So, but I have had a number of large repairs to make. So, but yeah, all very good points. So good debts, there are good debts, there are bad debts. Student loans traditionally are thought of as good debt. They're usually low interest rates and reasonable repayment terms. Now, that is not always the case. I've seen a number of student loans that are not federally backed and are private and have pretty high interest rates. So it's not always the case that student debt is a good debt, but bottom line is take a look at where inflation is, what is the rate on the loan, what other things are you getting for that loan. Obviously, with student loans, you're getting an education, which should improve your earning potential over time. So you need to look at all of the trade-offs of debt, but also in terms of dealing with debt, the first thing I always tell people is the best way to deal with it is, as you mentioned, Philip, not to get into it, right? Like, do not get into serious credit card debt. Now, as I mentioned in the last episode, I myself, in the middle of my career when I was in my early 30s, I got up to about $75,000 in credit card debt. And look, it is a giant beast when you sit down and look at it that way. But up until that point, one of the things that I had done, as you mentioned, pay off your credit cards at the end of every month. That was the way that I had originally approached it. In fact, I used a Quicken style software program that's now been folded into Quicken. And I actually created a separate account. And when I charged something on my credit card, I would enter it into that account. So I always knew kind of in the back of my mind what my running total for the month was. Now, of course, that's super geeky and super detailed, but maybe even just carry around a little piece of paper and jot down the things that you put on your credit card. So during the month, you have an idea of what you're spending. So hey, I've spent $300 or $400 on my credit card. I know that I have that cash to pay that off at the end of the month with my discretionary income. So not getting into debt is really the best way to deal with it on the front end. But let's assume that, like I did when I was in my early 30s, you do get behind on some things and, stuff happens over time and you intend to pay things back and it doesn't happen. So as you're sitting down and looking at debt, the first thing that you need to do is write down all of the accounts that you have. What amount do you owe? Mm-hmm. What is the minimum payment? And then what is the interest rate? And you want to focus in on trying to eliminate accounts. That is your primary goal. Many people make the mistake when they're trying to pay down their debts of thinking, okay, if I have $500 that I can put towards my debt and I have two accounts, that they should just split it evenly, $250 and $250. Right? And that absolutely is not the case. You want to start with your highest interest rate account, and you want to make as large of a payment as you can make to that one account and make the minimum payments to all your others. Now, the reason for that is, just like we were talking about, it's not allowing that compounding interest to keep going. And if you're at a 20 or a 25% rate, like you mentioned, Philip, it's going to be 2 to 3 years, and that's going to double. So if you're spreading out that, you're just allowing all of those accounts to continue churning away in interest. So the goal in trying to eliminate debt is to focus in on the biggest ones that have the highest interest payment and get rid of those. So make as big of a payment as you can to that account.
Dan?
Yeah.
How about what's your experience and what can you share with the listeners about that strategy you just laid out, where you list all your all the debt out, what your monthly payment is, what the interest rate is, and then taking that and consolidating that. Is there any tips or anything? Did you do any of that, and anything you can share there?
That's a great question. Yes. So the first thing that I have to say about that is be careful. I would say 50% of the people that I personally know that have gone into debt consolidation have ended up getting scammed. There are a number of companies out there that will essentially just redirect your debt payment information, and then they do not make the payments. They just take your money. In fact, the person that I mentioned, my girlfriend that I mentioned in the intro, I initially got her out of debt, and then she got back into debt later in life, and she tried to consolidate that debt at a certain point, and that happened to her. She was making payments to a company for well over a year before she realized that they were not making those payments. So first thing is, it is an area rife with scamming. So you want to do your homework. Better Business Bureau, ask people for referrals. But it can be a very good thing if you can get that. Now, the downside of that consolidation is this. Typically, those payments are not flexible. So while you are saving money and interest over time, if your financial situation changes and you are no longer able to make that payment, it could become problematic. So that's really the only downside of debt consolidation. So as an example, you may have a couple of accounts that have, like $25 or $30 minimum payments, and you then restructure that, and it becomes a $400 a month payment over a 3-year period or 5-year period or something like that. And they'll show you, hey, you're going to save all this interest. The downside comes in that if you can't make that $400 payment, you default. And that then causes more problems. So usually what I will recommend is, if you have some reasonable accounts that you only, like, actually I just did this with the last person. It's a friend of mine that I knew from when I was in California, and he in passing made a Facebook comment about being in debt and not knowing what to do. So I reached out to him and just kind of walked him through some things, and he actually had already gone down the road of setting up that consolidation, and I kind of walked him back from it, and he ended up only doing the highest of those accounts because he wasn't 100% certain that he could make that payment all the time. But it is definitely a tool that's out there, but it is by no means a cure-all, and you do need to be careful.
Thank you.
Excellent. So, the next step that I always like to tell people about, and this is actually the fun part of helping people with debt, is when you've written down your different items, your different accounts, spend some time thinking about a reward for yourself. And for each account, I always have the person write down what that reward is going to be. Nothing extravagant, but hey, maybe it's taking your partner out to dinner, or maybe it's taking a weekend trip somewhere, but something that allows you to have some positive feedback as a celebration for attaining that goal of getting rid of that account. So if you have 3 accounts that you want to get rid of with debt, write down 3 different things that are just small little rewards for yourself, or maybe you'll buy yourself a new golf club if you're a golfer or something like that. But just that little kind of attaboy, attagirl to use as a positive reinforcement. And it's so powerful. Like, learning to manipulate your own mind having that goal that's out there just adds that extra little bit of, on top of the, hey, I got rid of some of that debt. I got rid of one of my outstanding debts. It also just gives you that little bit of moment to relax and maybe splurge a little bit when you've been focused on bearing down and focusing in on saving so that you can get rid of that debt. Next on my list was the debt consolidation. So we already covered that. Bottom line overall with debt is, I mean, Philip mentioned it at the beginning of this discussion, rotating debt accounts, just keep them to a minimum. I at one point had 11 credit cards. Now I'm really good with my finances, but it got away from me. And obviously there were other things going on in my life when I got into, $75,000 worth of debt. But I was dealing with some depression, some substance abuse issues, lots of other things. But having too many credit cards certainly facilitated me getting that far in debt. I had probably $150,000 in open credit at that point. And it's just totally unnecessary. I mean, you just don't need it. Now, some of that was I signed up for a credit card at a football game because I wanted the giveaway for the football team that was offering it. And so there were some silly ones like that. But then I had a bunch of different silly accounts at Best Buy and Target and Sears, and it can just get away from you. It makes it more complicated. So overall, keep those rotating open debt accounts. And then the last thing that I want to cover in our main section today is something that many people think is true, but is absolutely not true. And that is, being married to someone does not make you financially responsible for them. What makes you financially responsible for them is becoming financially responsible for them. It's co-signing on a loan. It's commingling your assets. It's being on loans together. Many people do that. Many people see that as a sign of trust, and that's perfectly fine. Just understand that you do not need to do that. And having separate finances and keeping things separate can come in very, very handy. Now, a good friend of both Philip and mine started a brewery here in Minneapolis, and both Philip and I have mentored him on finances over the years, and he followed this and opened up his company. His wife owned their house. Their brewery ended up running into financial problems. They had some problems with their head brewer not...
the brewmeister.
The brewmeister was not being a meister. He was letting beer go out, not fully fermented, so things were exploding, and they lost
liability, red light.
Right? 2 months worth of inventory, and they ended up declaring bankruptcy. But because he kept his finances separate, he was able to declare bankruptcy, and she kept the house. She had perfectly fine credit. They were able to, in fact, buy a new house even while he was going through bankruptcy. Now, especially with home ownership, you do need to, obviously, if one person owns it outright, again, because being married doesn't make you financially responsible for the other person. If it came to a divorce, there could be a contest as to who owns that property, so you do need to have a contract that spells that out if you structure your finances this way. But just wanted to point out that this is something that, in fact, I didn't fully realize this until I was in my mid-30s. I had been a financial advisor and a wholesaler for years before I realized that being married does not make you financially responsible for the other person. It does give you some rights to asset transfer at death, but during life, it does not specifically make you responsible for that person. So with that, Philip, any thoughts to wrap up the main section?
I've got a few thoughts, and I'm going to tag on to the last one you had in a tip to everyone out there. One of the best things that Lisa and I did early on in our relationship, before we got married, we went to a weekend retreat. I think it was a marriage encounter retreat, it's called, and it was excellent in the sense that it made you talk about subject matters that from finance. One, of course, was finance, and we and individuals, as you're joined together through marriage or as a partnership, you're both coming from a different spot. You said it from the very, very, very beginning here. There's, how to manage money is a learned behavior, or unfortunately for some, an unlearned behavior because their parents never taught them. But it makes you come together, and we had to do some boundary work. And one of the first things we did is we did put we said it's just going to have one account, a joint account. Look, one credit card. If it's going to be, we're going to spend over $100, that was $300 approximately today, within 3% inflation. We had to talk to the other person to get an okay on it. We sat down monthly and reviewed our budget, and we set goals. So the first thing I would share here, it's not how much money you make, it's how much money you keep. And I've found procrastination, or the failure to pay yourself first, is probably your number one enemy from ever obtaining wealth. So you gotta, these, I think 8 words. Now that I said 8, next month it's going to be different. Probably not. Don't go there. Learn, what you need to do, and is learn to put yourself first in the payroll line here. And we've talked about it before. It's that 70-20 rule. Live on 70%, then save 20%, and then invest 10% for the long term. And for many of you, that'd be, as we talked about last time, tax savings. Set up your 401, a qualified plan. So that you get a tax break and use some of the government's money, or reduce your taxes, but it's set up for to obtain dignity in your retirement years. So first things first, put yourself first in the payroll line. Secondly, I would add this as a tip. Try to live within your means. What I mean by that, avoid at all costs of living for the social status. When we lived in Texas, they had a phrase, that person is all hat and no cattle.
I love that one.
Isn't it? It's just, everyone's living for the show. Prime example on this, I've got a 2001 King Ranch, speaking of Texas, Ford 150, paid $4,000 for that. I've got a 2013 Audi, paid $10,000 for that with 103,000 miles. We have a 2014 Subaru Outback, and keep these cars. We try to, older car to me equals wealth. It makes a wealthier you. Dan, here's an assignment. We could do this, Dan, but here's the assignment to our listeners. If you take a car payment, let's use an example. Henry owns a 6-year-old car. He decides to buy a new vehicle and then starts paying the bank $550 a month. After 6 years, you know what? He buys another new car. And after 12 years, all right, he's got an older car, but he has nothing in the bank. Now let's call her Annie. Annie owns a 6-year-old car. She decides to hold off for 6 years. So she invests at 550 for 6 years. And then she decides to buy a new car, and she keeps that car for, at the end of 12 years. How much money will she have? Here's your equation. Do 550 for 6 years at, I don't care, 7%, 10%. Then whatever that amount is, take that for the next 6 years at 7 or 10%. And what I want you to do is come back and tell us how much Annie has saved. And then what we'll do, we'll give you the answer as well in our next session, our next podcast.
Yeah, reach out to us on one of our platforms, Twitter or Facebook, and give us the answer to that. So it's $550 per month for 6 years, and then no more contributions, and then another 6 years, and let's just set the interest rate at 7%.
Yeah,
so
cool.
Let's just get it's a 7% rate of return, and so 6 years with $550 invested each month, and then investments stop, whatever that amount is, projected for another 6 years. So
beautiful.
Yeah, reach out to us on one of our platforms. Let us know the answer to that. And as Philip mentioned, we will share that on our next episode. Just to wrap up, a couple of main points: good versus bad debt. Figure out what debts you have that are serving other purposes, that are, within spitting distance of inflation. Those are debts that you probably don't have to focus on. Focus on that revolving high interest debt. Number one, don't get into debt. And, bottom line, that last point that Philip said, getting out of debt is really just an extension of paying yourself first again, right? We're going to sound like broken records on this, but if you're in debt, it's because you haven't been paying yourself first. And in fact, you've been paying other people too much. So it really comes back to, look, you need to pay yourself first, and setting up a system where that it becomes natural. Now, the one thing I will put out there, the people that I have helped get out of debt, because they become disciplined to get rid of that debt, oftentimes that then transitions into them becoming really good savers and investors after that. So keep that in your mind, and we will wrap up the main section and move on to our article for the week. This week's article, you guys are going to hear a lot from me this week. This is right up my alley. And
it's in your wheelhouse.
Say again?
It's in your wheelhouse. This is you get the energy on this one.
I do. As I mentioned early on in the podcast, I've done a little bit better a job of not just picking articles that make me angry. This definitely goes back to that theme. This is definitely in the pet peeve category. The title of this is Advisor or Broker: The Clarity the Industry Needed from the SEC. And I'm not going to bury the lead. There is no clarity. It's just, again, in my estimation, a complete and total failure. So I'll read a couple of things from the article and then respond to it. The SEC followed a course it had favored for a long time when it issued in late April an update to its frequently asked questions for regulation best interest, according to Bradley Bennett, a lawyer who served as FINRA Chief of Enforcement from 2011 to 2017. In that update, the SEC clarified that it will not tolerate brokers calling themselves advisors, quote unquote, unless they're registered as investment advisors. And in certain other cases, Bennett notes. And that certain other cases are... Where did it go?
Unless you work for a big corporation or a big broker-dealer or something like that, I suspect, Dan.
I can't find it in the article, but essentially it was, unless the company gives any other form of advice, and it's up to their discretion as a company whether they're allowed to use it or not. I've in fact have this down as a topic for a future episode, this confusion around titles in our industry. In my opinion, it is incredibly straightforward. Either you're acting as an advisor or you're not. And again, I don't have any problem with someone who just says, I'm an investment rep. My job is, you come to me and I tell you, I like this mutual fund. I got no problem with that. Mm-hmm. The problem I have is someone calling themselves a financial advisor, or even worse, a financial planner, and not doing a full plan for people. Next episode, we're going to talk about the 5 pillars of our article is the 5 pillars of retirement planning. And this confusion between making investment advisor this separate entity even adds to the confusion, because if you're an investment advisor, I run into RIAs all the time that don't talk about insurance. They don't talk about disability. They don't talk about long-term care. All they are is investment advisors. And again, no problem with that. But this idea that using the word advisor lends some credence to what you're doing, bottom line is that really none of it does. And none of the regulatory authorities really make any firm distinction. And as long as that's the case, it's going to be a source of confusion. And it is really, buyer beware. It's all on the investor to figure out what exactly that person is doing. I've said it time and time and time again. You can do all this, make people fiduciaries, say you've got BI, best interest, all of that. That's great. Just clearly defining different roles would do way more for the industry than all of this other nonsense. I was just reading another article where a person was being sued for, improperly advising someone and, wait for it, breach of fiduciary duty. And I've been saying this entire time we've been talking about this concept of fiduciary duty. Calling yourself a fiduciary doesn't mean you're not going to screw your clients. There are bad people who call themselves fiduciaries. Calling yourself a fiduciary isn't some magic wand that makes you honest.
Well, we could talk about Madoff, but that's for another subject matter. There's someone who was acting as a fiduciary, morally intelligent, but not morally competent. He knew what the right thing was to do, but he did not do it. It's a difference between knowing and doing. So you're right, Dan. It really doesn't matter. It comes down to integrity and your behaviors and your words matching.
Yeah, absolutely correct. And I fear even if we did have very specific titles, it still wouldn't remove that element of dishonesty, but it would at least give the end client an idea of what that person specifically does. I'm on a number of online websites where people ask questions, and one of the questions was from an insurance agent, and that person asked the question, hey, do I need to go on and become, securities licensed in order to be successful, essentially, was the question. My response to that was, well, no. You can have a huge impact just being an insurance agent, and you can help way more people by being just an insurance agent in terms of the number of people that you're going to help. you're going to help way more people if you just focus on selling life insurance. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, we need more of those people. Statistics show we've dropped below 25% of the population owning individually owned life insurance. And I want to say the number was over 50% as late as the 70s. So desperately, we need people to sell life insurance in this country. You just have to be comfortable with the fact that you're going to pass off other parts of their financial planning to somebody else and not be able to help them with investing, because you can't build a full investment plan with just life insurance products. Look, there's place in the world for all of these things, and I'm not saying one is any better than another. It's just incredibly hard for the end user to figure all of that out. And in stark contrast to what this article says, I don't think the SEC helped anyone with their recent statement that only investment advisors can use the term advisor unless your firm decides that you can for other reasons, and then anyone can. So, any final thoughts on the article before we move on?
Yeah, I got a couple. Here's what I struggled with: is what's the difference between advisor, SOR, and advisor, ADVISER, and
Right.
So I'm writing that, and I said, okay, well, so one who offers advice. In general, the advisor and the advisor are interchangeable. But however, because I had to look this up, an advisor is used more generally to mean someone who is giving advice, what they are doing. Whereas an advisor is more commonly used when it means the primary role, what they are, such as a job title. So, for those advisors that we have listening here, and you want to become a person who gives advice in a particular field, advisor. Well, going back just to the main topic, I would recommend 2 tips that I've seen great advisors do here, Dan, in helping their clients. They will give books upon graduation, because our actual educational system does not teach the concepts of money and how to make good decisions with money, generally speaking. So the rich, I'm going to put a plug in here. It's Rich Dad, Poor Dad is a great book to give as a graduation gift, or The Richest Man in Babylon, where they teach those actual concepts. And that's to me, that's giving good, that's acting as a good advisor to your clients. You're right. We didn't get any clarity from that article. No more said on that.
Yeah, actually, I don't think I told you this, Philip, but I did see an article that specifically focuses on the ORER debate, and I tucked that away for a future episode. So
good.
We will come back to that in a future episode and talk about that. It's a pretty interesting article. It talks about what the cost would be just to change materials in the industry. So super interesting on that note.
Dan, one last thing before we finish. I just would like to acknowledge your courage here today to share your personal story and how you managed and worked through your personal struggles. I felt just personally it was very powerful, and because it provides hope. And what I've learned is that we're all perfectly imperfect. And if change is going to occur, it must begin with me. And my hat's off to you. Well done, because I know you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I know how well you've done with managing that debt and everything. Then also like to just give a shout out to a very dear friend of mine. I'll just say Bill B. Bill is our advisor, and I quit managing our money probably about 12 years ago. I traveled a lot and just to help plan for that certainty of uncertainty, I said, all right, I'm not studying the markets every day. I'm not involved in it every day. And if anything happens, Lisa needs to have someone she can feel very comfortable with and can trust. So Bill sent us Rich Man, Poor Man, or Rich Dad, Poor Dad. And I used it, and I said, okay, we have 3 boys, and 2 out of the 3 boys, because the scheduling, said, hey, we'll participate. I bought them each a book, and we took Saturday mornings, and we did it through teleconferencing as well. And we took a chapter, and it was very rewarding and informative. And I highly encourage our listeners out there, if you haven't done that, the hardest thing one has to do is teach people how to think. And as a parent, you are the mentor. And if you can help your children with this subject of money, because one of the major causes of divorces is money, they'll tell you. So it's just a tool. It's a tool that can be mastered.
So with that, we will wrap up the article section of the podcast. If you have topics or questions for us, or if you have an article that you would like us to review in an upcoming episode, reach out to us on our Twitter account at value_ability. You can also contact us through our website, value-ability.com. Click on the Contact Us tab, and there's a contact form there that will get in touch with us. Or Facebook, search at valueability, all one word on Facebook, and we can get your comments there as well. Sign up for our mailing list, and we give updates and information on upcoming episodes through our mailing list, value-ability.com. Also on the Contact Us tab. Wherever you find us, please like, review, subscribe, and share. And again, sharing is the number one thing you can do for us. If you enjoy our content, you enjoy our podcasts, passing it on to 1 or 2 other people is a gigantic help to us at this point. So, next episode, understanding the 5 levels of mastery. Now, we did a video on mastery early on when we were starting to develop this, and then we decided to go with the audio-only podcasts as opposed to videos. So we are going to go back and cover the 5 levels of mastery for those who did not see our original videos. As always, thank you for listening, and join us next week. And until then, remember that financial success comes from building a plan on the foundation of your values, and building your ability will help you get there. This is a podcast collaboration, not a peer-reviewed journal or a sponsored publication. We make no representations as to accuracy, completeness, correctness, suitability, or validity of any information in this podcast, and will not be liable for any errors, omissions, or delays in this information, or any losses, injuries, or damages arising from its display or use. All information is provided on an as-is basis. It is the listener's responsibility to verify their own facts. You should be aware of the real risk of loss in following any strategy or investment discussed on this podcast. Strategies or investments discussed may fluctuate in price or value. Investors may get back less than invested. Investments or strategies mentioned on this podcast may not be suitable for you. This material does not take into account your particular investment objectives, financial situation, or needs, and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for you. You must make an independent decision regarding investments or strategies mentioned on this podcast. Before acting on information on this podcast, you should consider whether it is suitable for your particular circumstances and strongly consider seeking advice from your own financial or investment advisor. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of any other agency, organization, employer, or company. Assumptions are not reflective of the position of any entity other than the authors, and since we are critically thinking human beings, these views are always subject to change, revision, and rethinking at any time. Please do not hold us to them in perpetuity.